This video will define and explain the concept of indirect taxes as a form of government intervention in the market system. It will also be used to explain the two types of indirect taxes and show the effect on market outcomes using demand and supply diagrams. So there are two main types of taxes when it comes to government intervention in the market. There are direct taxes. They are called direct taxes because they are imposed directly on income. So what they do is essentially they reduce the consumer's income, which leads to a decrease in demand. So these are direct taxes. In this video, we are focusing more on indirect taxes. Instead of the government taking the tax directly from the consumer's income, it takes the tax indirectly by imposing the tax on expenditure. So instead of taking the tax from the consumer's income, let's wait until the consumer spends their income and we'll tax their spending. Indirect taxes, however, they affect supply because what they do is they actually raise the costs of producing the product because these taxes are actually collected from the producer. So we're focusing more on indirect taxes in this video. So, another word for indirect taxes is excise taxes or excise duties. That's another word for them. There are two main types of indirect taxes. There are specific taxes and ad valorem tax. A specific tax is a fixed amount of tax per unit. So say, for example, if the government says, I'm going to tax each unit at $1 tax per unit. So this adds $1 to the price. This is a specific tax. Most taxes are ad valorem. An ad valorem tax is a percentage tax. So the tax is calculated as a percentage of the selling price of the product, which means that as the price of the product rises, naturally the amount collected in tax will rise. So say, for example, if the government says the tax is 10% of the selling price of a product, that's an ad valorem or a percentage tax. So why does the government impose indirect taxes? Well, basically, they are used as a tool to, number one, discourage production and consumption of harmful products. And this may be a reason why the government taxes cigarettes and alcohol. These are harmful products, so we do want to control or regulate or discourage their production and consumption. At the same way, indirect taxes generate government tax revenue, which the government can use to finance other government spending, like healthcare and education. So these are two main reasons why governments impose indirect taxes. So we mentioned previously that there are two main types of indirect taxes. There are specific taxes and ad valorem or a percentage tax. These two diagrams are taken directly from the Jocelyn Blink and Ian Doughton ebook, the Economics Course Companion by Oxford University Press. It's a great ebook if you use iPads and iBooks in the classroom. I would definitely recommend that you buy that book. So, and a specific tax would shift the supply curve to the left or would shift it upwards by the amount of the tax. So here the amount of the tax is $1. So it basically just shifts the supply curve upwards, which is a decrease in supply by $1. A percentage tax, on the other hand, will also shift the supply curve upwards in the same direction, but as the price rises, the amount collected in the tax increases. So it's not a parallel shift. The curve actually gets steeper as the price rises. So this is the difference in the shift of the supply curve, depending on whether it's a specific tax or an ad valorem tax. So let's have a look at the effect of the tax on the different stakeholders. Let's start with producers and the effect on their revenue. Now in this example, the shift is caused due to a specific tax. The vertical distance between the two supply curves, that's the amount of the tax. Now here, the green box, this green box here represents the producer revenue after tax, while the red and the green boxes together in total, this represents the producer revenue before tax. So you can see here that obviously when the tax was imposed, the producer revenue actually decreased from that big red and green box in total to just this green box. How this is calculated is basically price times quantity. So the green box, the red box, if you take the old price before the tax times the quantity, this whole big box is the producer revenue. But after the tax, we know that the vertical distance between the two supply curves is the amount of the tax. So the producer will collect that whole big box in revenue and pay this as the tax to the government. So the revenue left over for the producer is actually that small green box. So an indirect tax will definitely decrease the producer revenue because part of what the producer earns pays to the government in tax. So we saw the effect on producer revenue. Let's see how much is collected by the government in terms of tax revenue. Again, this is a specific tax because the shift in the supply curve, it's a parallel shift. We know that the vertical distance between the supply curve is the amount of tax. If you multiply that by the new quantity supplied, which is that point here, so basically you multiply the amount of tax per unit times the number of units sold, and it will give you that brown box. So that brown box, which is the amount of tax per unit multiplied by the equilibrium quantity after tax, this will give you the government tax revenue. Remember, this box that I'm about to shade in green underneath, that's the producer revenue shown in the previous slide. So we've seen that the indirect tax shifts the supply curve upwards, which means there has been a decrease in supply. Because there's been a decrease in supply, naturally the equilibrium price rises. And that's because the producers will try and pass on some of that tax onto the consumers as a rise in price. And this means that the tax burden is shared between the producers and the consumers. It's split between the producers and the consumers. So how do you measure the tax burden for producers and the tax burden for consumers? Basically, the shift between equilibrium to equilibrium, that parallel arrow here that I'm drawing right there. So between equilibrium to equilibrium, that vertical distance, that's the tax burden on the consumers. So if you multiply that by the equilibrium quantity, it will give you that green box. So remember, that green box is the tax burden on the consumers because you get it by multiplying the vertical distance between the two equilibrium points multiplied by the new equilibrium quantity. And the remaining part of the government tax revenue, which is the red box, that's the tax burden for the producers. So we know that this whole box over here, which I'm about to draw, that whole big box is the government tax revenue. We saw that in the previous slide. That tax revenue, part of it is paid by the consumers because the producers will pass on the tax in the form of a higher price, which is that green box over here. And the remaining part is paid by the producer, which is that small red box here. You can see in the case of this product, most of the tax is paid by the consumers because the green box seems to be bigger than the red box. Sometimes the tax burden on the producers can be higher on the consumers, and that depends on the elasticity of demand for the product. So we've seen the effect of the indirect tax on producer revenue. We've seen how the tax burden is shared between the producers and the consumers, and we've seen how to measure the government tax revenue from the demand and supply curves.